Well, hello again, friends, and thank you for making the connection with us once again for our online midweek devotions. As a matter of fact, because today is Wednesday, July the 15th, that also makes this as close as we can get to our midweek and mid-month devotions, because July is just about half gone at this point. I really hope that you've been enjoying your summer so far. I'm enjoying mine. I'm out in my own backyard here today because it's a beautiful day. And speaking of summer, for the next 4 Wednesdays after this one, we won't be posting any midweek devotions online here, but I'd encourage you to stay in the Word on your own, and Lord willing, we'll find each other again here near the end of August. We're still planning to post Sunday worship services, but for the Wednesday devotions, we'll be suspending that for the next few weeks. But for today's devotion, we're going to be going back into the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. And the verse that I want to just highlight for you briefly is found in Proverbs 10:15, where Solomon, the biblical writer, sets us up with a pair of contrasting statements. I think you'll find it's something he does often. It's actually a pretty common technique with this kind of writing that he's doing. When you show one thing in contrast with something else, then it often gives a person a bit more perspective on what the writer is trying to communicate. It's one of the characteristics of a proverb in general, a lot of the time actually. And so this is Solomon's proverb today. In chapter 10, in verse 15, he says, "The wealth of the rich is their fortress. The poverty of the poor is their destruction." The wealth of the rich is their fortress. The poverty of the poor is their destruction. You know, during the past, I'll say 15 or 20 years, I've had the opportunity now a handful of times to travel to what are often referred to as developing countries for the purpose of mission. And one of the things that has struck me more than once on these trips is how often the very rich and the very poor live in one another's backyards. Like sometimes you can even see it when the plane is landing when you're first arriving in the country. You look over the landscape, and in one place there might be an enormous, maybe almost palatial kind of estate with these big sprawling buildings and all this open green space and typically a huge wall or a fence marking the outside boundaries of their property. And then just on the other side of that fence or that wall, maybe even not far away enough to be not heard by one another on a clear night, there might be rows and rows of rusted tin roof shelters built almost on top of one another. And there are people living in every one of them. That's kind of the image of what I was thinking about this week when I was reading this Bible verse. It's what came to mind for me. The wealth of the rich is their fortress. The poverty of the poor is their destruction. And again, keep in mind that Solomon's simply making an observation here. He's not saying this is how it should be, certainly. He's not saying it's how God designed it to be. He's just saying that in his experience and as he looks around the world himself, that's just the way it is. And it's interesting that it's the way it is in our world a lot of the time too. Like, and when a person like you or I read this, I'm sure that one of those two scenarios is seen as more desirable than the other. Like, of course, people would sooner be rich than poor. Of course, people would sooner be fortified than destroyed. And Solomon was quite possibly the richest person who ever lived, and most fortified, so I'm sure that he had a bias as well. But one of the biggest observable differences between these two groups of people, especially when you look at them side by side, the way Solomon is getting us to do here, is that those who are rich can choose to live the life that they want to live, for the most part, while those who are poor usually don't have that choice. That's why he says the wealth of the rich is their fortress, that they can really even choose to just surround themselves with things if they want to, effectively blocking them off from the realities of the rest of the world. But the poor can't do that. He tells us that the poverty of the poor is their destruction. It's something that's more or less unavoidable for them. And so if I can just speak to the rich for a minute, which, by the way, if you have daily access to food and clothing and shelter and safety, that's you. Whether you think of yourself as rich or not, most of us listening in here today are rich by global standards. If I can just speak to the rich for a minute, is it ethical for us to just be satisfied building our fortress, so to speak, to use Solomon's words, when we know there are others in the world who are being destroyed by poverty? Do we have the right goals in life even? Are we, who have choices and we can make with our own resources, are we doing enough to bridge the gap with those who don't have the same choices? In Proverbs 30 and verse 8, Agur, another biblical writer, shares a bit of a different perspective with us on wealth and the contrast between being rich and poor. As a prayer to God, he says, Lord, give me neither poverty nor riches. Like his idea is to avoid the extremes on either end. Instead, he says, give me just enough to satisfy my needs. For if I grow rich, I may deny you and say, who is the Lord? And if I'm too poor, I may steal and thus insult God's holy name. It's interesting, isn't it? He's basically saying, why do we have to live in a world of extremes? Surely there's some other way of looking at it that would be more honoring to the Lord. Wes Stafford, the former president of Compassion International and a lifelong advocate for the poor in our world, children in particular, puts it this way. He says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is enough. And so what we need to do as followers of Jesus is to determine what is enough. It's to determine where that line is and then leverage the rest to help lift the truly impoverished in our world into a place of enough as well. Something to think about. God bless you this week, everyone, and may you choose to be a blessing to others. We'll see you next time.